As anyone who's been in an argument knows, it's sometimes really hard to communicate your opinions to the other person and feel like you're, working towards a conclusion and trying to get to an agreement, right? And the reason that Ephrat Bitton's research is really interesting is just because she's taking all of people's complicated opinions with all of these different layers and trying to visualize them in a meaningful, abstract way that's really easy for people from the outside to understand. She's working on her PhD at Berkeley right now, doing more stuff with opinion space, and without any further ado, she'll probably start talking now.
Can you hear me? All right.
Probably a little higher, or I can just hold it.
Okay. Is this good? Oh. Thank you for that introduction. You actually explained it really well. So before I start, I just want to say I'm really excited to be here and to speak with you about my research. I also apologize that I don't have a slide advancer, so I'm going to be standing here for a good portion of the talk, but I'll try and move around as much as I can. So what is opinion space? This is a project that I'm working on for my dissertation, and it's a new tool that we're developing. We recently launched it with the U.S. Department of State, and it's designed to allow users to visualize, navigate, and filter comments in an online setting. And this might look kind of complicated to you right now, but you're going to see how it works later on. Two of the main questions that we're interested in, one is from a user's perspective. Can we construct a system that allows people to really understand where they fall in terms of their opinions on specific issues with regards to other people in the system? And from a community standpoint, can we harness the knowledge, the collective knowledge of our users to identify the most insightful and innovative comments that we've gathered? But before I go too much into that, let me explain to you why we actually care about a system like this. So most of you are probably already aware how powerful social media is today, right? But let's look at some of the figures, just a few that I've gathered Googling around. First is that 96% of people from our generation have joined a social network, okay? That is a huge amount. Next is that social media has overtaken porn as the #1 activity on the web, which also says a lot, right? I mean, well, yeah, it speaks for itself. The next is that 80% of Twitter usage is outside of Twitter. That means that people are tweeting from their phones while they're on the go as things are happening. They're getting information out in real time, instantaneously throughout the web. And this has completely transformed the model by which we communicate with each other, the fundamental model. And so we now need to start thinking about what this means in terms of the technology that we're developing and what are the impacts of these technology on things like politics. Okay, so in 2009, DARPA finally caught up with the rest of the world and realized that, well, there might be actually something to this social media thing, right? There's a lot of people that are using social media and they're sharing ridiculous amounts of information all the time, every day. So what they wanted to know is, can we actually harness this towards solving more large-scale, important problems very quickly? So they launched this really exciting competition, which they called the Network Challenge, or the Red Balloon Challenge. 3 weeks before the competition day, which was on December 5th, they said, okay, we're going to release 10 giant red weather balloons at undisclosed locations throughout the country, and they'll all be visible from some road, so they won't be in the middle of nowhere. And whichever team can accurately find the actual locations of all 10 of these balloons first gets $40,000. So people were very excited. They started talking about, well, what are ways that we can actually solve this problem? So people start looking at, well, maybe we'll look at satellite or aerial imagery or people from planes or whatever. But it quickly became apparent that the only way to really solve this problem was using social media. So the competition started at 8 a.m. on December 5th. And by 4 p.m., just a few hours later, the problem was solved. Okay, that's remarkable. The team that solved this was actually a team from MIT, and what they were able to do was create a really compelling incentive structure for people to report balloons, the locations of balloons. And this was extremely successful, but you can imagine that there are a lot of problems that can come up with this. So there's an incentive for competing teams to report false information, for example, and you need to be able to handle that. And so these are problems that we're seeing with social media today, aside from these kinds of competitions. As technology designers and developers, we have to think about how can we construct the proper incentives for people to participate constructively in our systems. So this leads me to think about what are the real benefits of social media. So the first thing that comes to mind is quantity. Okay, we're collecting an incredible amount of data, millions and millions of posts to Facebook feeds every day. Twitter can hardly handle the capacity, the number of tweets that are coming into their system, as you might be familiar with, right? So this is truly an incredible thing. But the problem is also quantity. So if you look at this example here, this is a post that was a blog post by Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook. I think it had something to do with privacy. And within a few hours after posting this blog, he collected over 35,000 comments. Okay. Now, I don't know how much time you have on your hands, and even I, as a grad student who occasionally procrastinates, doesn't have enough time to read through 35,000 comments. But if I wanted to, I could click on this button, and I could view a linear list of all of these comments, which is ridiculously impractical, okay? Many websites, almost all websites today display comments in this linear fashion, and it's not scalable. So a user might come to the site, and they'll read the first few comments and think that maybe they got the gist of the conversation. And if you're lucky, the site might have some kind of crude filtering model, such as on Dig, where you can thumbs up or thumbs down a story, and then supposedly the best ones will go to the top. But what we find is that because these models are so crude, they're really easy to game, and a lot of times extremists tend to take over these sites. So we need to start thinking a little more creatively. And this leads me to a quote by Warren Sack, who's a colleague at UC Santa Cruz. What he says is that we're now moving from an information age to an opinion age. And I really think this couldn't be more true. The early days of the internet was about collecting, gathering information, and displaying it, much like in a very fancy library, let's say. But today, it's more about social interactions. We want to know what our friends have to say about anything, and we want to be able to interact with each other and share information with each other. We don't just want this static collection of information. But when it comes to sharing opinions, we have to be really careful. There was a really famous study that was conducted in the 1970s, and what they did was they called thousands of people and asked them what they thought about the Public Affairs Act, if they agreed with it or disagreed. And what they found is that about 95% or something of the people had an opinion, one way or another, which would be great if it wasn't for the fact that there's no such thing as the Public Affairs Act. So people under the right or wrong circumstances will form opinions even if they're totally unfounded. And these opinions start to kind of self-reinforce each other if we're not careful. Hence the wonderful illustration by Escher, right? So we get this interesting snowball effect of falsehoods and bad information. And so we have to think about how we can create technology that avoids this problem. And I'm sure, at least with my experience online, I'm sure many of you have the same experience. Everyone is willing to share their opinion online, which is great. But as I mentioned, we really need to think about how we can handle that. Newspapers have had an interesting time with this. You might have seen in the news over the last couple of years, they've been really struggling with inappropriate and flaming comments that have been posted on their news stories. And some newspapers have gone to the point of completely eliminating comments from their sites. This one I thought was interesting, was actually forcing people to identify themselves when they post their comment. Another newspaper, I think the Sun Chronicle in Massachusetts, was very controversial. They actually started charging people to post comments, a small fee. But what these organizations are doing is introducing real consequences for your behavior online. And I think that that's a really interesting concept that deserves further exploration. But why does opinion matter? Okay, so let me give you two more statistics. The first is that 14% of consumers trust advertisements, okay? So most advertising campaigns on TV are actually not profit-making. However, 78% of people trust peer recommendations, product reviews, etc. This is a really big number. And what it means is that opinion online is an extremely valuable commodity, and at least from a business perspective, and we need to think about, well, how can we harness these opinions in a constructive way? How can we aggregate them to make, to understand what's going on, right? Beyond even just consumer goods. Let's take it to politics, for example. So when we started doing my research, we had to think about, all right, we're interested in people's opinions, but how do we accurately quantify or characterize opinion? So as you're probably familiar, many sites today will use what's called a Likert scale or a discrete scale. So they'll ask you to rate on, let's say, 5 stars, how you like this movie, or what you think about this article or this comment. So you really have to bin yourself into one of these categories. And what we thought is that opinion is really more of a matter of taste, right? There's a lot of nuances and subtleties in opinions that we don't think are captured well by this discrete scale. So what we started to look at is something that's called the visual analog scale, which is commonly used in psychological studies. And it's a continuous scale, so you would actually express your opinion by picking a point along this continuum to say, this is where I stand, right? So left would be negative or disapprove, and to the right would be approve. And if we can start to collect opinions in this manner, we can actually use interesting and powerful models from linear algebra, specifically principal component analysis, to take those opinions and project them down onto a plane. Okay, so here we have opinions from a higher dimension, I think from 10 dimensions, and they're projected into 2-dimensional space. So let me just give you a quick tutorial about how this works, because for a lot of people seeing it for the first time, it's hard to wrap your brain around it. So imagine if we're collecting opinions on 2 axes, or 2 issues, let's say. Then it's really easy to plot this in 2 dimensions. I think we all learned this in 4th or 5th grade. Now, what if we want to look at 3 options, right? 3 different categories that we want to collect opinions on. Now we have points that are in 3 dimensions. This is obviously still visualizable, right? We're all moving and working in 3 dimensions, but it's definitely not scalable beyond 3 dimensions. I think most of you will agree with me on that. And even in 3 dimensions, it's hard to truly visualize it because we're ultimately projecting it onto a 2-dimensional object, and it's hard to get this depth of perception, etc. But I'm going to keep this 3-dimensional example so that you can see what we're doing. So if we want to project this down onto 2 dimensions, you can imagine that we take a lamp and we shine it down on these 3-dimensional points, and whatever the shadows are of these points, that would be our projection. So here I have 2 sample projections. On the left, we're going straight down. And you can see this is actually a really bad projection because it looks like the green point is closer to the blue point than the red, when in reality the opposite is true. If you look at the projection on the right, however, it preserves distance relationships between the points much more accurately. And this is what principal component analysis is doing. Now, yes, we are going from 3 dimensions to 2, so there is some amount of loss of information, but in general, we're able to preserve these relationships as much as possible. So this is what the final projection might look like in 2-dimensional space. So now, this is data that we've collected from a project I'll tell you about in a second. But we have all of these, each dot represents a user. Okay, so we have thousands of users here. And using this model, principal component analysis, we know that any 2 points that are near each other in this space correspond to users that had similar taste or opinion. And people that are far away tended to disagree with each other. And so we can use this to start to make inferences about what people may like in the future based on the patterns of people nearby them in the space. So several years ago, we actually took this and incorporated it into a model for recommending jokes. It's on a system. It's still online. It's the URL is up there. If you're bored, you can check it out. But it was an exciting system. We actually collected a ridiculous amount of data, and the data sets are available online, so if you're interested in doing recommender systems or collaborative filtering, this is a great thing to look at. Many papers have been published based off of it. We then wanted to do something that was a little more socially responsible, so we created a similar system for recommending portfolios of nonprofit organizations that you might want to donate to. And so we were working in recommender systems and collaborative filtering for quite a while, but what we realized that was missing from these systems was a social component, right? So people were sharing their opinions, but in a very indirect manner. And we wanted to see how can we get people to interact with each other. And we looked back at our algorithm, and we realized that we have this really interesting projection in 2 dimensions that, as algorithm designers, was giving us a lot of intuition, but the users themselves were not seeing any of this. It was all in the back end. So what we wondered is, would this projection actually be useful for people in terms of sharing their opinion? And thus, Opinion Space was born. You can visit the site at this URL, but you can also Google for it if you're looking around. Before I tell you too much about the system, let me just mention that there's a large team behind this project. We have a lot of undergraduates that are working on it, graduate students, and professors from all kinds of departments, including theater, someone from the School of Information, and we also work with a lot of consultants. So as we're designing this system, we started thinking about, okay, what are our goals? And we looked at it from 2 perspectives. One was from the perspective of an organization. What do they want to do? They really want to understand the diversity of opinions of their users, right? And they want to be able to do it quickly. And they want to engage with their community. They want to be able to solicit feedback. And they want to be able to quickly identify which are the most insightful and innovative ideas from their community members. From a community member's perspective, so they want to understand what is their relationship to others in the community. You know, are they on the outskirts? Are they in the middle? They want to be able to engage with a diversity of viewpoints and ideas, and they also want to be able to express their ideas. And so going back to diversity, this relates to a concept in biology called hybrid vigor. You might be familiar with it, but it's the concept that if you take 2 species and you cross them, the final product may actually be more robust than any one of them on their own. And so we really want to take this analogy to opinion sharing, right? If we take people from diverse backgrounds and put them in a room together, we might get some ideas and insights out of it that might never have happened if people were only speaking with people of like-minded users. So something that we wanted to be very careful about is this idea called cyberpolarization. The term was coined by Cass Sunstein in an article that talked about how people, when they're going online, or actually even in everyday life, are seeking out like-minded communities. And then they stick to these communities, and these communities start to reinforce their own opinions, and they become more and more extreme over time. So you can look at, for example, the Huffington Post versus the Drudge Report. Right? These are extremely different viewpoints, and they never share opinions or ideas with each other. In fact, they have very little tolerance for each other, and that's actually detrimental towards making progress in terms of politics and other social issues in our society. So there's a lot of, we use a lot of sites today to help us customize our experiences online, and that's great. We use recommender systems, we use Pandora to find wonderful music based on people that share music tastes like our own. We use Amazon to find books, we use Netflix to find movies. But what we have to be careful is that people are now starting to use news sites to tailor their own experiences, right? And so the question we have to ask is, what happens when people can avoid the news more easily than they can access it? What does this mean, right? They're now only giving themselves access to biased information. And as we have the younger generation growing up, and they can't, what's happening to them, right? How are they forming their knowledge about the world if they don't have access to a wide diversity of opinions and of information? The next question I want to ask is, what sort of scalable communicative structure would support the needs for real democracy? And I think that the key term here is scalability, right? So in the old days, we used to have town hall meetings, and people would come together, and they would share their opinions, and everyone could maybe be heard, and decisions can be made. But this is a much bigger world now, and scalability is a really big issue. So yes, maybe we can get everyone into the same room together online, but if it's not in a manageable way, then we might not be as productive as desirable. So opinion space begins to answer these questions in 4 components. The first is visualization. Okay, we believe that visualization is an extremely powerful way for people to absorb and understand incredible amounts of data. Right, we're visual beings. This is how we interpret information. And so we want to be able to bring this component to a system like this. The second one is that we want to be able to level the playing field. And this goes back to the ideals of deliberative democracy, which is that everyone should have an equal chance to have their opinions heard. We don't want to just throw ideas out because they don't fit with the majority. And so this is something that we're seeking to do with our site. The next one is wisdom of crowds. So we have potentially thousands of people that are coming to participate, and we want to be able to quickly identify what are the insights and innovations here. And so to do that, we want to use the collective knowledge and wisdom of our users to try and find those. And I'll talk about some models for that soon. And the last one is gameplay, right? We don't want this site to feel like you're doing your homework. We want people to enjoy using the site, and we want them to come back. So we want to make it fun and interactive, and develop an exciting point-based system or game system that will encourage competitiveness and encourage people to be productive on the site. So there's a lot of related work on visualizations that have been done, not specifically with regards to comments, but other types of data sets. There's a lot of sites online right now that help people figure out which political parties to vote for example. They're not very visual, but they're extremely valuable, and they're based on information that people have been sharing about their opinions, which are very interesting. There's a lot of research that's been done, but I don't have time to get into all of it. So let me start to tell you about the story of opinion space. So during Obama's campaign, before he was elected, one of the big issues that he was talking about is that we need to get people more involved in our government. We want to know what the people have to say, and we want to use technology to do it. So after he was elected, my advisor, who I forgot to mention, is Ken Goldberg at UC Berkeley, So he had a contact at the State Department and pitched the idea to them. They loved it. And so we started to develop the site just for them, a second version of the site. This is what it looks like. I'm not going to go in and give you a live demo, but I'll explain how it works. As I mentioned before, it's still online if you want to participate. But when you come to the site, you click Get Started, and you're presented with what we call 5 propositions. Okay, so this is our way of getting kind of an idea of your baseline opinion on foreign policy issues. So the first one, for example, is the most urgent security threat to the United States is a terrorist armed with a nuclear weapon. And we ask you to indicate your opinion on this statement using a visual analog scale. So you can see there's a slider below it, and you can say how strongly you agree or disagree with it. And we ask you to give all 5, or to answer all 5 of these. Then there's also a discussion question that changes every once in a while. Right now it has to do with prevention of nuclear proliferation. And you can provide a comment based on saying your opinion about the subject. So once you fill out this form, you're taken to the opinion space site. This is actually my account, so my point would be the yellow halo right here that you can see. And I'm also presented with a random sample of about 15 or 20 different comments out of the thousands that we have. And this is using principal component analysis, so the same model that you saw earlier. So what we know is that anyone that's close to my yellow point agreed with me on those 5 propositions, and anyone who's far away tended to disagree with me. And I know also that every point corresponds to a user, so what I can do is I can start to click on these points and read the comments that they put. The comments will show up on the left here. And you can also see how they answered the 5 questions. This is, okay. Sorry, this is not on the slide, but we ask users after they see a comment to rate the comments, but not just on how much they agree or disagree, but also how insightful they think it is. So we actually ask them to rate it on 2 dimensions. And we use this information along with their position information in the space to try and find what are the most insightful ideas, and also the ones that promote consensus from a diversity of users. Because those are the ideas that are ultimately going to be the most meaningful in terms of making progress. And that's really the core of the work that I'm doing, and so I'll just give you a little hint of what that is, or how that works. I'm calling it a spatial reputation model, and it's based on an assumption from collaborative filtering, which is that people that are near each other in the space, so people who have agreed with each other in the past, are likely to agree with each other in the future, right? I think that's a pretty reasonable assumption. And so if we take that as fact, then what we would expect is that users would rate their neighbors very highly, and they would rate people far away very poorly, right? So this kind of behavior is actually not surprising. What would be surprising is if the user rated their neighbor poorly or someone far away highly, right? And those are the kinds of ratings that my model is actually emphasizing in the system. So we're trying to find the comments that are promoting some kind of consensus and also eliminating kind of the noise or the expected data. One of the nice artifacts of this model that we're developing is some kind of inherent resistance to manipulation. Now, you're never going to build a system that's going to be totally resistant to manipulation. If you can, you're going to make a lot of money. But you can start to add constraints to the system that make it difficult to do. So we're starting to look at different types of attacks that people can perform. The first would be a Sybil attack. What that is someone will come to the site and they'll create many false profiles, right? And they'll use those profiles to unfairly promote or demote a target. Okay, so one way to do it, and the way to, according to my model, if they want to have the biggest impact, they would need to create a series of false profiles that are as far away from their target as possible, assuming that they wanted to promote it, right? So this is actually fairly easy to detect. Another option, if they don't want to be detectable, would be to create a lot of random profiles and then try and promote it that way. But because of the constraints of my model, it would require significantly more effort to do. And so it's providing inconveniences for someone who wants to game the system. Another thing that we're looking at would be false feedback. So what's interesting here is that you could not position yourself truthfully in the space, so truly represent your opinion, and at the same time unfairly promote your neighbor. And you can't do the opposite either. So again, it's not a panacea, or it's not a cure for manipulation, but it at least provides some kind of constraints that are useful. So we had a really wonderful experience working with the Department of State. We learned a lot of lessons. We were able to engage users from all around the world on really important foreign policy issues, and we got a lot of great feedback and ideas that came out of it. And overall, people were very constructive on the site. There were some caveats. The first is that the State Department is very, very concerned about privacy measures. There's actually, I think, a federal law or regulation that on government websites we're not allowed to collect any kind of self-identifying information from our users. And from a researcher's standpoint, this really limited what we could do with the data that we have, right? So you can imagine it'd be really cool if we could view the data, how it was distributed between male and female, let's say, or by country, or any other kind of demographic information. I mean, this would make the site much more powerful, but unfortunately we can't do it here. There's also a really slow vetting process, so anytime we wanted to change, let's say, the discussion question, it has to be approved through a hierarchy of people, and that makes it difficult to respond to changes in the world quickly, which has made it difficult. And we also found that we require a more compelling incentive to get people wanted to know that they were being heard. We would have liked to promise something like, oh, you can have a meeting with Hillary or something like that, but that's obviously difficult to do, and so we're now exploring different ways to get people to want to come back and to continue to participate. But this is an ongoing problem, and I think one that deserves a lot of research. We did get a really nice quote from Hillary about it, though, so that made us very happy. Okay, so let me just show you a little bit of the data. So we released the site, I think, in March of this year. So far we have almost 5,000 users. We got some nice press, which was good. We've collected over 3,500 comments and almost 30,000 comment ratings. So we're getting a lot of people to rate each other, which is great. We got some interesting distributions on the ratings. So you can see, for example, that people were very quick to give something a totally negative rating. If you look at the graph up on the upper right, right? But the barrier to entry for a very positive rating is a lot higher. So this was some interesting behavior that we were excited to see. This is another graph that or plot that we really liked. So as I mentioned before, people were rating comments on 2 dimensions. One is how insightful it was, and also how much they agree with them, with the comment. So this is a plot of insight ratings versus agreement. You can see there is some correlation, so if you agreed with it, you're more likely to find it insightful. But if you look at the lower right quadrant, this is the quadrant we're really interested in, right? This is the quadrant that shows comments or ratings where the person didn't agree with the comment, but they found it really insightful. And I actually think that it's a good thing that this quadrant is relatively sparse, because it makes our job a lot easier to find the good comments, right? So this is the unexpected behavior that we're really looking for. We also conducted a user study. If you're interested in learning more about it, it was published this year in the ACM Conference on Human-Computer Interaction, or CHI. But what we did, what you're seeing up here is actually the first version of opinion space, but we wanted to compare it to a linear list of comments, right? The traditional model. Is this actually providing some benefit over these linear lists? So we compared it with that, and also something that we called a grid interface, where we didn't use this principal component analysis projection, but we just plotted points on a grid in random order to see if the projection actually introduced any kind of difference. And the results that we found were very encouraging. So we found that people were much more engaged with actually both the space and the grid interface. And so to us, that means that any kind of visualization is much more compelling than seeing a long, long list of comments. We also, which I was really excited about, is we found that people using opinion space had more agreement and respect for the comments that they read than if they were reading a list. So what we're hoping is that this means is that people, when you're able to understand the context of where you fall with regards to everyone else, you might be more willing to listen to what other people have to say. So you can say, okay, I know that I probably won't agree with this person, but let me see what he says, and maybe it's something that's interesting to me. And so then we also found that the opinion space was more conducive to finding useful comments, as reported by our users. So this was very encouraging and exciting for us, and we're now designing another study on opinion space that's going to look at some of the more sociological questions that we want to ask. This is a plot of, so as I mentioned, we're going from 5 dimensions down to 2 dimensions in the space, right? So when you change your opinion on one of those propositions, then you're not going to move in totally perpendicular directions because there's only 2 that you could move in. So this shows you the directions that you would move in as you change your opinion for each of the 5 propositions. And this was really interesting to us because so the way to interpret it is that the bigger the angle is between 2 propositions here, the less correlation there is. And so this started to give us some insight as to what people are thinking about these propositions and how to better design propositions in the future. Because this is something that we learned was actually extremely difficult. I mean, we're engineers, right? So we're not very aware of the impact that a slight change in wording can have on how people will respond. So this has been quite a learning experience for us. This is that's the mean and actually standard deviation of how people rated these propositions. And another thing that we're really interested in is how people's opinions are changing. Okay, so this is not a static site. People can go in and they can say, well, you know what, I actually feel slightly differently now about this proposition. And so we've actually been tracking that. And one thing that was really exciting is that you can see the number of opinions changed for the nuclear weapons question was much higher than for any of the other questions. And that, we think, has to do with the fact that one of the discussion questions had to do with nuclear proliferation. So people were reading the comments and then actually changing their opinion, which was very cool to see. And in future versions of the site, we're exploring ideas for how to actually visualize the change of opinion. So maybe some kind of movie form where you can actually see how points are converging or diverging over time. Should be very cool. I'm going to skip that. Okay, so some next steps or future work. We're looking at a new form of projection, which is called canonical correlation analysis. It's a very cool statistical method. And the way it works is now instead of just using your 5-dimensional slider or proposition data, we actually want to use your comment data as well. So this is a statistical technique that will combine both information and try and find a correlation between your opinions here and your comment and make a much smarter projection. So we've been experimenting with this a bit. This is one of the outputs that we have, and you can see that we're getting some really interesting patterns, right? So we're starting to see themes or topics that are coming out of these this projection, and you can now start to explore the comments in a more intelligent way, which makes things easier for the user. This is a new version of the site that we're also developing, so soon there will be a plug-and-play version available on our website that you could create then your own opinion space and ideally use it in your classroom or with your club or whatever in the wild web. And there's some exciting new features that we're going to be introducing. So we have Facebook Connect that will actually allow you to log in with your Facebook account, automatically pull in your picture and any demographic information you have. And we can use that to start to filter the comments in interesting ways. And we're working on a recommender system for comments, so now you can get personalized recommendations. And this is one thing that I'm working on for my dissertation, and I just want to mention that we have to be really careful in this context, right? Because I don't want to just recommend to you the comments that you're going to really like. I want to recommend to you a diversity of comments that you're going to tolerate. And so this is interesting both from an algorithmic perspective and also from a UI perspective. And we'll be publishing a paper on this shortly, which we're very excited about. And then we're working with several other organizations that have expressed interest in this technology. And so these different versions of Opinion Space might be popping up very soon across the web. So I don't want to end my presentation with the answer. I want to leave you some questions to think about as you go home and as you go on doing your research and your work. First is, again, the question I asked earlier, right? What sort of scalable communicative structure would support the needs for real democracy? And I also want to ask, what are the social responsibilities of online news and discussion sites, right? We don't want to just create the next site that's going to bring all of the extreme liberals together, okay? We have big problems in this world, and we're not going to solve them by encouraging cyber polarization. And finally, when you do work on sites like this, or when you visit sites like this, you want to think about who is being silenced here. Who are we not hearing, and why? And where can we hear that information? And how can we make that available to everyone? And how can we make people want to read that information and expose themselves to that? And that's it. Are there any questions?
So when you showed the visualization for opinion space, the size of each sphere was the
Yes. Okay. I didn't.
Of the opinion?
Yeah, I forgot to say that. Yeah. So the bigger a point is in the space, according to my algorithm, the more insightful that opinion should be. So now you can quickly start to figure out, all right, which one, am I the kind of user that wants to just read the best comments and get out of there, or do I want to explore other comments that people are unsure about? And we've actually introduced a scoring system that encourages people to rate comments early on and rewards them for being good reviewers of comments. So the better you are at predicting how people will respond to the comment, the more points you get. And so this is one of the incentive structures that we've introduced.
So this is a really good follow-up question. I noticed that you had two scores, one for your author score and one for your reviewer score. How do you weight those to affect the size of your point?
Right. So the size of the point is actually just the author score, which tells you how good of an author were you. Right. So we want people just to rate the comment. The reviewer score is more of a way for you to gauge your own constructiveness on the site. But I'm not a big fan of having two scores in the system, so we're actually looking at ways to combine the two. And we're doing some research on that right now. Yeah.
So there are many products that exist now, such as Yelp.com, stuff like that, that are basically social media services driven by user reviews and user evaluations. Could this model be applied to something like that to
Yeah, definitely. This is something that I'm actually working on as a side project. Right now we're specifically looking at Twitter, for example. So, on these sites, obviously we don't have a way to collect these proposition data, but you have other ways to characterize the users. So on Twitter, for example, we have this social network, which can actually be represented in a matrix. You also have interesting data, such as like when people are retweeting each other, and you can count that as, let's say, a vote. So there is data that we can infer and use to make similar projections. And so now we're looking at how we can apply this to other systems. Yeah. Yeah.
You're using X and Y and size for the different projections, and instead of using like color and or shape and strengths to kind of
Yes. So again, I forgot to talk about this. But so as you're interacting with the system, when you rate a comment positively, it will turn green for you to symbolize, approval. And if you rate it negatively, it will turn red. Now, this is only in your perspective, but it's a way for you to understand, okay, how am I responding to these comments, and are there any patterns in my response? But in future versions of the site, we do want to use color for more powerful visualizations, such as by demographic, for example. So I think it'd be really interesting to see, like, well, what's the spread of male and female, for example? And yes, color can be extremely useful. Yes? Anyone?
How do you reconcile educated opinion with somebody who's just got out of the
Yeah. So.
Does your mission just basically come from education when you got those two way apart opinions?
Yes, so that's a great question. So this touches on why we actually ask people to rate on two dimensions, right? So you have agreement and insight. So you can imagine that there are many cases where there'll be a comment saying, I think that we should work to end world hunger, right? So I would say, yeah, I agree with that comment. That's great, but it's really not insightful. And so this is why we really thought it was necessary to have these two dimensions. It gives us more flexibility in terms of how we can filter out those random web comments from the actually insightful ones. I think in the back. Right, so in that case, at least within the constraints of the system, I would say this would be a case where you would say, okay, I don't agree with what you're saying, but I think there is some value to what you're saying, so it might be insightful. But right now, that's the only way you could really respond to a comment. In future versions, there might be more interesting ways, like threaded comments, for example, where you could then start to form responses. But I think that would be the best way to do it right now. Yeah? Right. So that is very true, and that's a great point. Oh, sorry. So she was asking how the system should change when we're looking at a retail space where you might actually want to read comments by people that are like you. So this takes it to more of a traditional recommender system than what I'm talking about. And then you would just swap the back-end algorithm for how you would find insightful comments. Okay, so it would tell you, and just like in what we were using for Jester, the joke recommender, and for donation dashboard, it would tell you, okay, who are the people in the system that are like myself, right? And you can find them very quickly. So if you go to a traditional site like on Amazon, I'll get some recommendations, but I have no idea what went into that. I don't know who is out there, who they're getting these ideas from, and so this provides a more interactive way for you to understand what's going on. And this is something that we've seen in our recommendation system research, is that people don't want to just think this magically made some great recommendation. They don't trust it, right? So that's why some sites are starting to do things like explanations. So Amazon will actually now tell you why you were recommended something, but only based on how you've responded to other products, but not in terms of other people. And I think that this gives you more of a connection to the people that are in the system.
As far as computing requirements go, does the system require its own dedicated hardware? So if I was a small company and I wanted to get user feedback, would that be feasible?
Yeah, I mean, so right now this runs on a server that's shared with several of our other projects. The algorithms that we're using are really, really scalable, which is nice. So to compute the projection into the space, it can be done in constant time, which is pretty awesome. So it's not, the hardware requirements are relatively trivial, I think. Yeah.
On the slides that you had previously, you talked about the idea of having a level playing field and then the wisdom of the masses. Do you see any type of contradiction between these two, or would there be conflict between these two modes?
So this is actually, I'm glad you touched on that. Did everyone hear that? What's the contradiction between having a level playing field and using the wisdom of crowds to filter information? And this is something that I'm really interested in for my dissertation work. And this is why I asked the question at the very end, who is silence, right? So ultimately, whenever we have a filtering method, we're silencing people, right? We're saying, okay, this idea is not as important as this other idea. And there is this tension or contradiction between that. And so that's why I'm really interested in designing algorithms that will try to minimize this tension. But I think that ultimately we can't resolve it totally. But we can try and do the best that we can. Yeah.
You mentioned using Facebook influencers and information. Are you kind of using the graph again to see where your connections or friends are on the graph? Would they be anonymous and as you look for the name, do you see if they're attracted to you, or would that be situational?
Right, so this is something that we've discussed a lot, and I think it depends on who's actually, what the specific implementation of the system is for. So every organization we've talked to has different privacy concerns. For maybe people of our generation or people in high school now, they wouldn't care if everyone knew who their friends were and where they fall and actually what their names are, but we probably would obscure that data in many of the systems that we're using. So maybe just you could see where people fall, but maybe you don't know their names. People would have to be able to opt out or opt in. But privacy is a huge issue here, and we're constantly trying to juggle those things. Yes?
So you mentioned that one of the big sort of goals behind the opinion space was to reach a consensus on ideas and to sort of like get all the opinions heard. If that's your end goal, do you think there's any value in having a method of like conversation so that two people with separate opinions, instead of just posting it to opinion space, could like sort of, can talk to each other or post, comments in relation to each other's comments? Or?
Yeah, definitely. So the question is, can we, are we interested in allowing people to really respond to each other in the space and actually encourage a discussion between people of different backgrounds? Right now, the way the system works is you broadcast your opinion and people respond to it with numerical ratings, but that's it. Yeah, we are really interested in allowing for these kinds of discussions. From a UI perspective, we haven't totally figured out how to do it yet. So if you guys have any ideas for that, but this is something that we're looking at for future iterations of the site. Yeah. Yeah, so this would be so the insightfulness of the textual comment that the person provides. Yes. So this is a great point, and this is something that we've had a lot of debate about in our group, and I totally agree with you. As I mentioned before, something that we've seen is that it's really difficult to word a proposition in a good way, right? And especially as engineers who aren't as they don't speak very well, right? So, yes, we haven't actually looked at being able to respond to each individual proposition, but one thing that I've argued for in our group is that I think that the propositions should be more focused and more closely related to whatever the discussion topic is. But, yeah, we have to be very careful about how we word these propositions so that they're not loaded questions. And one thing that was difficult when working with the Department of State is that, they ultimately had to have approval for the questions, and so we didn't have nearly as much control as we would have liked over the wording. And they weren't as concerned about what this means in terms of our projections and how it biases our data, but we were. So I think moving forward, there's definitely an art and a science to it, and we have to try and learn more about that, but something that we're very much aware of. Yeah. Yeah, so we actually did release the first version of the site as open source, but then we took it off when we started working with the Department of State. So we are very much interested in doing that kind of thing, and we want it to be available to everyone, and we want people to be able to create their own opinion spaces. So one of the problems is obviously just hardware. We can't support that many. So funding is somewhat of an issue, but ideally we would like to see that. We would like you to be able to come to some site, maybe use it as a plugin in your blog, but just create your own opinion space. Although, touching back on the previous question, we would need to train our users somehow in terms of how do you create a good version of opinion space? How do you create good propositions? But that's, much further down the road. Mm-hmm. That's interesting, yeah. Sorry, so he was saying that in terms of communicating with another person, another node, is that you could actually, two options would be to request a sidebar with them, so maybe some kind of private messaging, or you could request a public forum where other people could view and then respond as well. But again, we would really like to do the second, but we'd have to, the natural solution would be to take that to more of linear threaded comments that we're familiar with seeing, and we kind of want to avoid that. So we're trying to think about how we can make this more visual and interesting. Yeah. yeah. I mean, it can take any number. It's entirely scalable. The projection will change a lot more in the very beginning when we're getting 1, 2, 3, 10 users. But as the system grows, then the projection becomes a little more stable. And so it won't change as much. But yeah, it can handle a large amount of users or small. Yeah.
So like one of the great like universal truths is that people have a lot of opinions. Building off of that, do you see any value in having sort of like multiple opinion spaces, like having one that's sort of like a political discussion and other ones that feed off into like different sort of outlets that people like talked about and try to reach a consensus on?
Yes. So the question is, do we want to have multiple opinion spaces with different topics that maybe branch off of ones that were inspired by discussions in other opinion spaces? And yes, we totally want to do that. I mean, you know, we can have one on foreign policy. We can have one on abortion, like that was mentioned before. You can have one in your philosophy class. You know, we can have them for any type of topic that you can imagine. And we want to see that. We don't want it to be one big centralized thing because we want to be able to really get an understanding of the baseline opinions of our users so that our projection is more meaningful. Yeah. Yes. So it's difficult to. Oh, sorry. So the question is if I have any numbers in terms of how many of the comments in our data set were malicious or manipulative. We haven't read through all of the comments and decided ourselves, but we do have a way for people to flag inappropriate comments on the site, and people do use that feature. And I'm actually one of the moderators that goes in and decides whether a comment should be removed or not. And to be honest, over the last few months, we've maybe had 2 comments that were inappropriate, that used, let's say, inappropriate language or were very, inflammatory. I don't know in terms of the rest of the comments what that means in terms of how many there are there, but if it's any sign, I think that there are few, which is something that we're really excited about. And yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
You mentioned that one of the challenges of opinion space when dealing with the Department of State was the vetting process. Could you talk a little bit more about some of that?
Yeah. So we have sorry. The question is about the vetting process in the Department of State, if I could speak a little more about that. And, we have 5 propositions up there, but we actually went through dozens that we brainstormed and thought of ourselves. And then, our contact at the Department of State is actually the head of new media there. And so she was extremely busy. I mean, around that time, there was all kinds of, like, the Haiti earthquake and the floods in Pakistan. And so, we'll send her our propositions, but we won't hear back for several weeks because they were actually very busy with more important matters. And also in terms of discussion questions. So it's a slow process, and it was mainly done, communication was mainly through our advisor. And so we didn't have a team that we were working very closely with, and can you hear me? Is that good?
Our electronics are telling us to wrap up soon, I guess.
Yeah, it was a slow process, and they also had a lot. They had to approve all of the propositions, and I didn't necessarily always agree with them, but I think ultimately we came to a pretty good consensus between the 2 groups, and I'm pretty happy with how it's turned out. Okay, that's a great question. So it was, when we're doing the dimensionality reduction, we're losing information. So approximately how much of the variance are we losing in this projection from 5 dimensions to 2? And I don't remember completely off the top of my head, but I think we're keeping about at least 70% of the variance. So, yes. So we have done some rotations just for aesthetic reasons, but there's no axes in this space, right? So up, down, left, right doesn't matter. Yeah.
I was just curious, like with the idea of having responses, comments to responses to those comments. Have you ever considered maybe having the form itself is responding to the proposition, and then for each response to the proposition, you also have a comment to the individual response, and then having an opinion space for that to represent the comments in the discussion of that particular response.
Interesting. So for any set of propositions, you would have, let's say, 5 different opinion spaces that would respond to each of these. Like each opinion space would respond to each one of the propositions?
Well, kind of, but like if I was responding to one particular proposition, and I had my comment on the opinion space, and my friend or anybody else online wanted to respond to my particular response, what if there was like a recursive structure where each individual response to the main 5 questions also had an opinion space with people responding to.
Oh, I see. So it would branch off into an alternate space. Yeah, that would be cool.
Would that work, or are there issues with that? Or?
No, I don't see why it wouldn't work. The only thing that's tricky is temporal information, right? So in a threaded comment list, you actually see the train of thought of the conversation. Here you don't, but I think that you could potentially address that with perhaps, let's say, arrows between comments that kind of show the path of the conversation. I think there are some interesting UI features that would need to be looked at, but it might be possible. That's a good idea. I don't know. That it? Okay. Thanks for coming.